I'm Mike Ward and welcome to Conversations Healthcare, a video series brought to you by DRG, part of Clarivate. In this series, we are speaking to opinion leaders to explore the challenges industry faces when trying to develop treatments to provide the most benefit to patients. It's well established that the cost of development is rising, and yet the ability to pay for new treatments is more constrained. A significant proportion of approved treatments that are shown to be safe and effective actually still fail to fulfill their anticipated potential. The most common reasons for missing these expectations are limited market access, underestimating market needs, and suboptimal product differentiation. While there are externalities which contribute to this that companies have no control over, thorough planning and disciplined product launch execution can mitigate the risks of commercial underperformance. To discuss these product challenges and potential solutions, I'm delighted to be joined by my DRG colleague, Alison Kneen. Alison is a Senior Vice President at DRG Abacus, part of Clarivate, and the not-for-profit Centre of Innovation and Regulatory Science. She's responsible for global market access and regulatory policy strategies and solutions. So Alison, I hope you and those you care about are keeping well, and thanks very so much for joining me.
Thank you, Mike, and certainly delighted to be here and everybody keeping well, as I hope our listeners are as well.
Great, thanks very much. So Alison, as we know, within the life sciences ecosystem, no company, not even the largest multinationals, has all the answers when it comes to successfully launching a medicine. So what are the most common challenges biotech and pharma companies come to you with for help?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question, Mike. Really, it's a very transient and fast-changing landscape out there. So most commonly, the challenges that our clients have are basically, how do we know what's happening in the marketplace? What do I need to do? And most commonly, really, it's about what is the evidence that I actually need as a company to get over the national reimbursement hurdles? How do you communicate the value of your product, whatever it is, or your innovation? And so who are the stakeholders involved and the timelines, etc.? So that's where we'll typically look at a product and say, what's happening with your evidence? So quite often we'll do like an evidence gap analysis where we'll say, this is what the standard is for your in-focus country that you're focusing on. This is what the requirements are. Here's where your evidence stack up, or perhaps there may be areas that are slightly weaker. And we will then advise the client on what they need to do to actually overcome that hurdle. So that would be one of the bits on the evidence side. And then, of course, I've already alluded to, it's all about how do you communicate once you've got that evidence and what do you do to best capture it. So what we'll typically do is we will make our global access advisory team will actually map out all of the timelines and the different stages of what a product or a client needs to do to actually get into that marketplace. And we typically call that our route map to access.
Right. So looking, more specifically at some of the challenges that you just mentioned, in your experience, what are the key questions that companies need to ask themselves, to ensure that they're actually gathering the right amount of evidence, either to demonstrate that their therapeutic solution will be considered cost effective, or, for example, inform a go, no-go decision in that clinical development?
Yeah, it's very much about understanding the landscape in that market that they're operating within. making sure that they're really up to date with the policies and the methodologies of how their product is going to be assessed. So that's all about really understanding how the health technology assessments at country level will operate and what methodologies those regulators are actually using, because the scope is changing. I'll give you an example of that, Mike, if I may. So with digital therapeutics, for example, if you go to the US market, highly developed, they've got their methodologies and process set out for looking at these products coming into the marketplace. However, if we move across to Europe, within the EU5, they've started to develop the methodologies of how they will assess these products and new innovations coming to market, but they're not all through federal law yet. So the challenge for the client is understanding, number one, what the methodologies are and that they've got the right evidence to support how their product will be assessed, but also really understanding the timing as well of that. And that's just one bit on the landscape, on the environment side of things. If we focus in even further on pharmaceuticals, for example, I mean, sort of in the last 2 years, there's been a big shift to lots of rare and very specialist diseases coming into the marketplace. Now, quite often that throws up a challenge, because if you're having to get your evidence together to get your product assessed, you really need to understand what is the established standard of care. So that's really one of the first steps when it comes to one of the rare and specialist diseases, because on that standard of care, that's the basis of how we actually would then go about building the health economic model. So the start of really saying, okay, with the evidence that we've got, how are these patients normally going through the healthcare system at country level? Yeah. What are the challenges? Where are the lever points? Because that's how you start to build your evidence and your health economic argument, which is really crucial to get into the marketplace. So that would be one of the first areas that we'll look at. And we have a very specialist, obviously, health economic team that do that. One of the other areas is looking at the other measures. For example, our clinical outcomes assessment team very often are having to develop patient related outcome measures as a standard that they can be measured against. Because that doesn't exist for that product, because it is very rare and specialised. And we've a cracking team, as you probably are aware, that actually specialise in this and really can help companies shape where they want to be and make sure that their product is actually being seen in the right light, and that they're very early on the product life cycle, really early at like phase 1, when the clinical trials are still going on, that they're starting to actually collect that right data. So what we'll always advise clients is engage early. So if you're going to use a consultancy, start planning really early. And even if you're not using a consultancy, in-house in the client's own matrix launch team within the pharma company, start as early as you can planning, because it can never be too early. And keep re-evaluating the market as you go, because the landscape and the policy and regulation we've just sort of discussed and talked about keeps changing, and you need to make sure that you're entering the market at the right time with the right information so that you can get the right assessment out the other end.
So, I mean, you sort of highlighted there, sort of, some of the ways that, in fact, that you can and your team can help. Can you give us some specific examples of what you've done, and sort of highlighting actually what the outcomes were of that assistance?
Yeah, sort of I briefly mentioned the clinical outcome assessment team. We actually did a really interesting piece of work actually only a couple of months ago, where we actually helped define an outcome measure, a patient-related outcome measure for a blue chip pharma company. It was a disease area where there hasn't been a lot of work. There wasn't really a lot of support for it, and it wasn't really classified as a high unmet need. But for that patient emotionally, because we were looking at sort of alopecia areata, so that really is a big issue if you're a patient. So we were able to work in partnership with the pharma client to develop what is now seen as an internationally recognized patient-related outcome measure. So that's one of the things that that particular team has done. And we have many instances of things. If you look at some more the traditional type things that we do as well, where you're looking at reimbursement and what will the reimbursement pathway be. This was actually quite an interesting one. I got called into the back end of a meeting, as happens to all of us every now and again, and I overheard something and I thought, oh, ears pricked up. And the company actually had told their all of their stakeholders internally and externally, because they were just about to be acquired by a larger pharmaceutical company. So they had communicated that they had an ultra orphan drug coming through, which was going to go through NICE's highly specialized technology route. So really the communication to the internal and external stakeholders, because this was then in the public domain and was fueling the shareholder price of the company. And that was then being seen as a highly innovative product, so really prime for investing. Unfortunately for them, they had misunderstood that there was a difference between orphan drug status and ultra orphan, and also that the route to reimbursement, which is very strict criteria for a highly specialized technology, they didn't actually meet the criteria, so they wouldn't be going down that route because it had just recently changed. So again, coming back to really understand the landscape and the market and the timing. So what we were able to do with that was we were able to do quite a bit of analysis, because obviously we specialize on regulatory and both in the consulting arm of the business that I represent and also the not-for-profit side of the business. We were able to do a bit of analysis and actually say, well, you know, it's actually not going to make a difference on how your product is reimbursed. Okay, this has recently changed. So we were able to work out a very robust communication plan for them. And the outcome was that everybody won. The drug was reimbursed. They got acquired by the larger drug company, and nobody lost face, and the share price maintained. So that was a win for all parties. And that's quite often what it's about. It's all trade-offs and making sure that all stakeholders win, because everybody wants the best decision.
Yeah, actually, Alison, you've mentioned the Centre of Innovation, Regulatory Science a couple of times. Could you just sort of explain, because you described it as a not-for-profit within Clarivate. Would you mind just sort of explaining what it does and how it kind of gives you that I guess that view or that transparency on what sort of the various regulatory stakeholders are thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so. Well, as you say, this is our not-for-profit side of the organization, and this is where we'll work. We have grants, for example, coming in from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, etc. And this gives us the opportunity to use our experts, and it is a bespoke group of experts that we have within CIRS that don't work on normal consulting projects. And this allows us to work very closely with the global regulators. So all of the HTA bodies, for example, are pretty much represented throughout the world within the CIRS group and are actually members of that group. And what it's really about is sort of the academics coming round the table and really looking at, have they got the best methodologies? Are the processes as robust as they can be, to make sure that each country is being able to help their patients and their constituents get the best product at the best time at the right price. So value for every sector of the healthcare system. So we'll work very much hand in hand, but it also gives us the opportunity to work in less established markets as well. So for example, at the moment, we're doing a large piece of work looking at the emerging markets and how we can actually help them through the CIRS group to actually get the methodologies and processes right, so that they can assess product, pharmaceuticals, digital solutions, etc., devices, medical devices in the marketplace, so as they're doing that equitably for their people in that respective country. For us, it gives us a wonderful insight as well, and it keeps us sharp and at the top of our game, and we can see and understand what the regulators are thinking before it very much comes into policy. So the other bit of what's really important with CIRS and what they do is that they're there not only to look at what the methodologies are at this point in time and analyze, is it being successful or is this being super duper and the rest need to engage that way, but it's also about being able to be ahead of the chase and see what's happening in the market and advise strategically so that governments can shape their healthcare policies to the best effect, really.
Yeah, great. So earlier on, you talked about how you were sort of, at a very, very early stage, you were sort of, helping business sort of develop its strategy. I just wonder, sort of, at what point in an asset's development timeline should companies actually start evaluating the sort of potential value proposition, and which stakeholders should they actually be engaging with at that point?
Yeah, well, we'd say as early as possible. So basically from phase one, when you're starting and you've got your clinical data coming through, that's when we would start engaging at a very early stage on the global value dossiers, where we're looking at the clinical evidence. So we have a large team of scientific medical writers, all who have PhDs. Actually, I think we're one of the most robustly qualified medical writing teams actually within consultancy. And we will look in very fine detail at that evidence as it exists at that point in time and start pulling out what we would call the aspirational value messages for that product or innovation. Of course, as you get more clinical information becoming available prior to launch, you will have to tweak it and modify. And then we'll take that early information and then we will test it with key stakeholders and decision makers. So we're talking about, we'll test with clinicians, we'll test with national payers and local payers, and we may even on occasion test with patient organizations as well, to make sure that we're getting what are the true unmet needs from all of the stakeholder mix that will be making the decisions on moving forward. And then of course, the closer you get to market, you finalize your global value dossier for your affiliates. You test again, and quite often we'll run workshops and stuff with the internal stakeholders and the affiliates to make sure, in case we have to actually tweak the value messages, particularly for a country or affiliate area.
So, I mean, and those messages, I mean, so what are the best ways for companies to sort of communicate, say, for example, that value to the various stakeholders that you've just identified? What tools are available for people?
Yeah, well, we've got a plethora of tools. It's like, where do I start and where do I finish? I think the secret always in communication is keep it simple. Yeah, so keep the messages as simple as possible. And also, I mean, we've all got the marketing background where we know sort of if it's visual, you'll retain X amount. When you hear it, it's another, you know, the whole bit. So we've got lots of different methods to use in different areas. So we do a lot of iPad models. So we'll actually put health economic models onto iPads so as we can communicate, well, this is what the model actually shows and here are the key messages from that. And that's one way to communicate very simply, and we can do it not only just with health economic models, but sometimes also these tools can be used to communicate value, for example, in tenders. So maybe in an area where there's national tenders, like say with blood disorders, so big haemophilia contracts that last for 2 to 3 years, companies will often need to be able to go through a lot of complex data and cost calculators to be able to show the benefits of the drug from the clinical studies, but also the benefits if you use so much of this treatment and so much of that treatment, and what will the financial outcome be for the national body making that assessment. We do all the traditional things as well, of course, of like flashcards, leaf pieces, smart decks as well, which have become actually in this this awful time that we're living in at this point in time with the pandemic, where having highly visual and very creatively designed smart decks when you're having to connect over the internet rather than face to face is becoming ever more important. And we've got an absolutely top-notch design team in-house that are very, very skilled at doing that. In fact, one of our clients, they don't actually allow us to put any slide decks out for any work that we do for them unless it's actually gone through our design team. So that's how popular they are. They're certainly in big demand.
So, so in the examples that you shared, you know, there clearly is, you know, a lot of interaction. You sort of said, you know, how you've been in meetings, you know, this relationship with sort of, you know, sort of these decks, etc. What does engagement between your team and clients, you know, look like? And you know, are these sort of all discrete one-off arrangements, or are there off-the-shelf opportunities?
Yeah, sure. Well, in the consulting side, we do very much bespoke work for clients. So everything is totally bespoke to that client, because each client will have a you know, a particular need and something that they want particular to their product. So that's very bespoke. But having said that, within the wider DRG Clarivate, we also have an awful lot of product solutions as well, which are off the shelf. So we're, you know, we're quite well renowned for some of these excellent insight reports that we have, etc. So there's lots of other product as well. But on the consulting side, which I look after, it is totally bespoke. And what we do is we actually, to ensure that we get the best possible people and the best possible solution for that client, we work in a matrix structure, which is very similar to our clients generally, but we have very specialist teams. So we have a unique and specialist health economic team, a health technology appraisal team, a systematic review team, a global access advisory team, and a value communication team, which will include programmers to help us with platforms, etc., and doing iPad models, etc., and also our quite famous design team. So we have these specialist teams which can all input into the particular requirements for a project for a client. So what we do is we'll look initially when the client comes to us, whether it be directly because it's repeat business, because we do a lot of repeat business, or it may be through an RFP for someone that we haven't worked with before. And we will allocate for each project a project lead, a strategic advisor, who's an absolute expert in that area that they want to look at, whether it be launch excellence or it may be a therapy specialist for a very rare disease that we need to put onto it. And each project also has a project manager, and the project manager is quite a key role. So what that does for the client, it means that you've got a core team who are always there as a point of contact. And the project manager is very much like the facilitator to join all of these specialisms together to give the bespoke solution. So they're almost like a conductor of an orchestra, and you bring in your violins when you need, which would be maybe your health economist to do your model. You will then bring in your global value communication section when you need to do your GVD, you know, to assist then communicating the value, etc. And it goes on like that. And that works incredibly well for us, because one of the key comments we've had back from clients is they like the strategic advisors on the project, because the strategic advisor will spar with them quite often and say, okay, so you're considering doing this, but really have you considered what the outcome may be, and should you perhaps look at it from this view or another view? And we get really good feedback on that, and it means that you're getting as a client a true expert rather than a generalist consultant to give you the solution. And that is important, because as we discussed earlier, you really need to be at the top of your game, because it's a very fast moving landscape, and especially on this HEOR side where it's very technical, methodology driven, etc. So you've really got to be up to date.
So, I mean, as a final question, you know, that increased focus on sort of your evidence-based, value that, therapeutic approaches now have to show, it's still a relatively new phenomenon. So, how sort of quickly are these value assessment strategies evolving?
Oh, very quickly indeed. I mean, I've been in market access for a long time. You can probably tell by the white hair that I think for about 32, 34 years now. And market access, I was actually in the first team that was ever conceived in market access in the days of Astra, which then became AstraZeneca, because I came in from the pharmaceutical side into consulting. And my goodness, all I can say is the changes, have just been, market access is a relatively, new phenomenon in the last sort of 10, 15 years. But my goodness, have things changed. But having said that, while methodologies and things change, the core bits of market access are still there. They just sometimes reinvent them and call them something different. So you might get a little bit of change in terminology, but the core bit at the heart, it's getting value and making sure, the value of your product meets what the policies are and the methodologies for that company, and address what the unmet need is for the patient. And what gets us out of bed in the morning, Mike, what really gets me out of bed in the morning is making that difference and making sure that I can give the best possible solution to the clients so that a patient can get the treatment that they need. And that for me is what it's all about.
Alison, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today. So the insights that you were sharing there around sort of, product launch, market assessment, etc., they're going to resonate with a lot of our listeners. So they're going to find that very, very valuable. So if after listening to this broadcast, you'd like to listen to future conversations in healthcare, follow our LinkedIn page, because there we will be posting alerts to future episode releases. So in closing, I'd like to thank Alison again for joining us, and thank all our listeners for tuning in. So until next time, stay safe and healthy. I'm Mike Ward, and I'll see you in the next episode.